Winter did not begin when the first snow fell. For the Vikings, it began weeks earlier when daylight shortened and work shifted from the fields to preparation. Cold was not treated as a sudden threat. It was expected and planned for every single year. In the north, winter was approached as a fixed part of life that could be managed with discipline. Homes were reinforced before temperatures dropped. Food was preserved while animals were still strong. Tools were repaired while hands could still work without freezing. By the time snow covered the ground, daily life had already slowed into a protected and controlled rhythm. Viking communities did not survive winter through luck or courage alone. They survived because winter was treated as a system that demanded preparation long before the first storm arrived. This early preparation is what allowed warmth to be held. It is what prevented hunger from spreading, and it is what kept families alive through months of darkness and cold. The firewood calculation. Vikings never approached winter heating with guesswork. Firewood was not gathered based on hope or habit. It was calculated carefully, using experience passed down through generations. Long before thermodynamics existed as a formal science, Viking households had developed a working understanding of thermal energy through observation and survival. They began with clear constraints. A typical peasant household consisted of 4 people living in a single shared room measuring roughly 14 square meters. Winter officially lasted from Michaelmas on September 29th to Candlemas on February 2nd, a total of 126 days of continuous cold. There were no breaks in this period. Fires were needed every day for warmth, cooking, and basic survival. Modern experiments that recreate Viking homes and heating methods show that maintaining livable indoor temperatures required approximately 50 kilograms of hard wood per day. This amount allowed families to keep the space warm enough to survive while also cooking meals. The math was simple but unforgiving. 126 days multiplied by 50 kilograms resulted in 6,300 kilograms of firewood. Over 6 tons of wood were required for a single household every winter. This is where Viking precision becomes clear. Peasants understood that not all wood produced the same heat. Centuries before anyone measured energy density or thermal output, Viking woodcutters knew which trees mattered. Oak was considered the best. It was dense, burned slowly, and produced strong, steady heat. 1 kilogram of seasoned oak produced roughly 4 kilowatt-hours of usable thermal energy. Beech was nearly as effective, while ash was acceptable but less ideal. Coniferous woods such as pine, spruce, and fir were avoided for primary heating. Their high resin content caused them to burn too quickly, produce heavy smoke, and throw sparks that could ignite thatched roofs. Protocols specified hardwoods for overnight and space heating, while faster-burning woods were reserved for short cooking fires. Firewood cutting began in August because wood required seasoning. Freshly cut wood contained 50 to 60% moisture by weight. Burning green wood wasted energy boiling water instead of producing heat. To solve this, Viking households followed a strict seasoning protocol. Wood was cut, split immediately, and stacked in a circular pattern known in Germanic regions as a Holzhausen. Bark faced outward, split surfaces faced inward. This allowed air to circulate through the center, while rain shed off the outside. Properly stacked wood lost up to 40% of its moisture within 6 weeks. By the time the first snow arrived, the firewood was ready. Shelter reinforcement. Once firewood had been carefully calculated, cut and stacked, Viking households moved to the next priority: preventing heat from escaping. Generating heat required enormous labor. Retaining heat, if done correctly, required far less effort. Viking people understood this clearly. Instead of burning more fuel, they focused on stopping heat loss at its source. Viking homes were structurally simple. Walls were built using wattle and daub, a framework of woven branches covered in a plaster made from natural materials. Roofs were thatched. Floors were dirt or rough stone. There was no insulation in the modern sense, yet archaeological experiments show that these homes could maintain indoor temperatures 10 to 15 degrees Celsius warmer than the outside air, using relatively small fires. This was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate sealing.
The reinforcement protocol began with wall inspection. Wattle and daub walls expanded and contracted with seasonal temperature changes. By late summer, after months of drying, small cracks appeared throughout the structure. Every crack allowed warm air to escape and cold air to enter. Even narrow gaps caused measurable heat loss over time. Viking builders treated these cracks as serious problems.
The repair mixture was prepared in August, while materials were easily available. Clay came from riverbanks, straw came from the recent harvest, fresh animal dung was collected from livestock. The proportions mattered greatly. Too much clay caused the plaster to crack again during winter freezes. Too much straw weakened the structure and caused it to crumble. The standard mixture used by Viking masons was roughly 3 parts clay, 2 parts straw, and 1 part dung. Modern materials science confirms why this worked. Animal dung contains fibrous material and natural binding agents that strengthen the clay and reduce cracking. Roman engineers used the same principle more than 1,000 years earlier. Viking builders did not know the chemistry, but they knew the results. Every visible crack was filled, every gap was sealed. The work always began at the roofline and moved downward. Gravity helped the fresh plaster settle into gaps and bond more effectively. This systematic approach ensured that heat loss through walls was reduced as much as possible. Walls, however, were only part of the problem. Windows were the largest source of heat loss. Glass was extremely expensive and almost non-existent in peasant homes. Most windows were simply open holes in the wall, sometimes covered with oiled linen or animal bladder to allow light inside. During winter, this was unacceptable. The winter protocol required these openings to be sealed completely. Wooden shutters were installed, and gaps around them were packed tightly with straw or moss. In the coldest northern regions, some households went even further and mortared their windows shut for the entire winter. Families accepted months of darkness in exchange for warmth. This decision becomes logical when the energy cost is understood. Heat loss through a single 1 square meter opening could equal the loss of 5 to 8 kilograms of firewood per day. Over 126 days, that opening could cost between 600 and 1,000 kilograms of additional fuel. The final reinforcement step addressed the floor. Dirt floors allowed cold to seep upward continuously. To counter this, floors were covered with thick layers of straw or rushes. This served 3 functions. It insulated against ground cold, absorbed moisture, and created a renewable surface layer. As the top layer became dirty, fresh straw was added. By spring, the compacted layers were removed and used as fertilizer. The floor was rebuilt every year. Their homes were not crude shelters, they were carefully optimized survival structures. If this level of Viking engineering seems surprising, it is worth remembering that primitive often meant precisely calculated. The Blood Month Protocol. Anglo-Saxon sources referred to November as Blood Month, a name that appears in written records dating back to the 9th century. This term was not symbolic or dramatic. It described a carefully chosen period for livestock slaughter and meat preservation. The timing was deliberate and based on environmental conditions that maximized survival chances.
By November, animals had reached peak condition. They had fed all summer on pasture and spent autumn consuming harvest leftovers. Fat reserves were high, which mattered greatly for preservation. At the same time, the first frosts had arrived. These cold temperatures acted as natural refrigeration, slowing bacterial growth during the butchering process. Yet deep winter had not fully set in, which meant people could still work outdoors for long hours without the extreme risks that came later. The protocol was precise. Not all animals were slaughtered. Breeding animals were preserved for future years. Younger animals with growth potential were also kept alive. Only mature animals and those unlikely to survive winter feed shortages were selected. For a typical peasant household, owning 2 pigs, several chickens, and occasional access to communal livestock, the calculation was clear. 1 pig was slaughtered. When properly preserved, this supply provided roughly 80 to 100 kilograms of meat. This supply could last through winter and often into early spring. Slaughter was rarely done alone. It was a community operation because the work was labor-intensive and time-sensitive. From killing to full preservation took 2 to 3 continuous days. Families coordinated schedules. One household might slaughter on Monday, while neighbors assisted. That help was later repaid when another family slaughtered midweek. Cooperation ensured speed, efficiency, and reduced waste. The process followed a strict order. Blood was collected immediately. Nothing was discarded. Blood was cooked into blood sausage or black pudding, foods that had to be eaten within days. As a result, the week following slaughter was one of the richest diets of the year. After this, the carcass was butchered carefully. Different cuts required different preservation methods. This was not random. Lean cuts were salted. The salt ratio was critical. Too little salt allowed bacteria to survive. Too much made the meat inedible even after soaking. Long-term preservation required roughly 10 to 15% salt by weight. Historical manuals confirm these ratios, while lighter salting was used for meat meant to be eaten sooner. Fattier cuts were salted and smoked. Smoking lasted 7 to 10 days in a smokehouse or chimney area. Hard wood was used to produce steady smoke with minimal resin. Temperatures were kept low between 20 and 30 degrees. Hot smoking cooked meat, cold smoking preserved it. Smoke compounds penetrated the surface, inhibiting bacteria. Combined with salt and dehydration, this method preserved meat for 6 to 8 months. Archaeological analysis confirms that bacterial growth was effectively halted. But meat was only one part of winter survival. It was a foundation, not the entire system. Storage engineering. Preserving meat and food meant nothing without proper storage. Viking people understood this clearly. Storage was not simply a hole dug in the ground. It was a carefully engineered system designed to control temperature, moisture, and airflow
without any form of refrigeration. The winter storage protocol consisted of three connected parts: the root cellar, grain storage, and the active pantry. The root cellar was the foundation of the entire system. These cellars were dug below the frost line, usually between 1.5 and 2 meters deep. At this depth, temperature remains remarkably stable throughout the year. Even in regions where surface temperatures swung violently between seasons, underground temperatures at 2 meters varied only 5 to 10 degrees annually. Viking builders did not know the science behind this, but they understood the result. Modern soil science explains it through thermal mass. Earth absorbs and releases heat slowly, becoming a natural temperature regulator once below the surface layer, affected by daily temperature changes. Archaeological excavations show that Viking root cellars were deliberately designed. Entrances were often inside the house, reducing cold air infiltration. Ceilings were kept low to limit the volume of air that needed temperature control. Ventilation was minimal but carefully balanced. Too much airflow raised temperature and dried food. Too little airflow caused moisture buildup and rot. Small vents allowed slow air exchange without destabilizing conditions. Inside the cellar, food was organized by preservation method and storage duration. Root vegetables were placed directly on the dirt floor or stored in wooden boxes filled with slightly moist sand. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beets were packed this way. The sand prevented dehydration while darkness stopped sprouting. Properly stored, these vegetables lasted 4 to 6 months. Preserved meats were hung from ceiling beams, carefully spaced so no pieces ever touched. This allowed air to circulate around each cut, preventing moisture buildup and mold growth. Hanging meat also kept it away from rodents and ground moisture. Instead, grain was stored in sealed ceramic or wooden containers placed in the driest part of the house, usually near the hearth, but far enough to avoid heat damage. Containers were sealed with beeswax or animal fat to block insects and rodents. A typical household required roughly 200 to 300 kilograms of grain for winter, depending on region and crop type.
Grain was not ground all at once, it was milled as needed. Fresh grinding preserved nutritional value and reduced insect infestation, which was common and largely accepted. The final element was the active pantry. This was the accessible storage area inside the living space. It held only the current week's food supply. The logic was simple. Opening the root cellar multiple times a day released cold air and disrupted stable temperatures. Instead, the cellar was opened once per week. Food was transferred to the pantry, and the cellar remained sealed. Through this system, Viking people created what modern engineers call a cold chain. They did not understand microbiology, but they understood that cold, dry, and dark conditions prevented spoilage, and they engineered their environment to maintain those conditions consistently. Backup systems. Every survival protocol assumes normal conditions, but Viking people knew that winter did not always follow expectations. The winter of 1315 proved this brutally. Cold lasted longer than planned, harvests failed, stored food sometimes ran out, preservation methods could fail. Because of this uncertainty, Viking never relied on a single solution. They built multiple layers of backup food security into their survival system. The first and most important backup was pottage. Pottage was not a fixed recipe, it was a method, a continuously maintained stew that adapted to scarcity. The base ingredients were simple: water, grain, and root vegetables. This mixture simmered in a pot hanging over the hearth for days or even weeks. As food was removed, new ingredients were added. Water was constantly added to maintain volume. pottage was infinitely expandable. When food supplies ran low, more water was added. The stew became thinner, but it remained edible. Old bread could be broken in, foraged greens could be added, bones were reused for second, third, or fourth boilings. Nutritionally, pottage was more effective than it appears. Grains provided carbohydrates and some protein. Root vegetables supplied minerals and vitamins. Meat scraps or bones increased protein and fat content. Historical analysis suggests that diets heavily based on pottage could sustain life indefinitely, though comfort was minimal. The second backup was winter foraging. Even in cold conditions, certain foods remained available. Nuts cached by animals could be found and taken. Viking law often forbade this, but survival overrode legality. Pine nuts from conifer cones and acorns were used, though acorns required extensive processing to remove bitter and toxic tannins. Rose hips, rich in vitamin C, stayed on bushes into early winter. Families dug through snow to find frozen root vegetables missed during harvest. Small animals were trapped. Fish were caught through holes cut in ice. The third backup was controlled semi-starvation. This was not desperation, it was a strategy. Viking people understood that lower activity reduced caloric needs. During extreme periods, healthy adults deliberately ate less and slept more. They effectively entered a state similar to hibernation. They understood energy management without formulas, food preservation without laboratories, and risk mitigation without statistics. Their knowledge was practical, cumulative, and deeply rooted in lived experience. And when we study what they did, something important becomes clear. What has been lost is not just old techniques, but old principles. The idea that preparation matters, that knowledge must be preserved and passed forward, that survival is systematic, not accidental. If you value learning what actually worked, not what we assumed worked, consider subscribing to continue this exploration of forgotten engineering. Thank you for watching.